Okay. Here we go. So, on our right, we have some bacteria. This is E. coli. This is Staphylococcus. Causes problems with hospital infections that are resistant to drugs. This is a cyanobacterium that eventually was incorporated into a eukaryotic cell. And then viruses. And then here's our eukaryotic cell. And you can see it's a lot more complex. Now, with viruses, well, life is defined as organisms that have cells. Viruses don't have cells. All they have is a little strip of either DNA or RNA, a protein coat that can bind to certain cell receptors, and then it injects its RNA or DNA into the cell that's incorporated into the cell DNA, and it uses the cellular machinery to actually pump out more copies of the cell. It's the perfect parasite. It doesn't need all the baggage that you need for a cell. It uses the host's machinery. Now, some people don't consider, since it doesn't have cell metabolism, they don't consider viruses alive. But I do. Also recently, there are these kind of megaviruses, much larger, almost the size of, let's say, an E. coli or something like that. And these things actually have many, many more genes and are kind of in between having a metabolism of their own. It's not complete metabolism, but it's something. And so it was kind of, you can't really have a virus like E. coli or whatever that might cause disease unless you actually have a host already. But these megaviruses, they're kind of in between what people used to think of as alive and dead. The thing is, viruses, since we just went over evolution, viruses, of course, evolve, just like other living things. Okay, so here we are. Now, it used to be thought of organisms, cells without a nucleus, used to be thought of as prokaryotes. It's not. Prokaryote is a term that let's see. It's a term, it's not monophyletic, which means it doesn't include all taxa within the group. In fact, archaea is actually closer to eukaryotic cells than they are to bacteria. Now, this is kind of what a cell looks like. There's a plasma membrane, and it's made of a phospholipid bilayer, which means that let's see. Yeah, hydrophobic tails, right. It means these are hydrophobic. That means they don't like water. In fact, you probably know that fats usually aren't soluble with water. And then on the outside of the cell is this aqueous solution, water. And then, shut up. There are these things right here, so that actually things can get in and out of the cell. In some cases, it's just a gradient. You guys would probably think about mixing, let's say, paint. You have white paint and you have red paint. If you mix them together, it'll all be pink. Okay? So, but what happens normally is there's a gradient, usually between positive charge and negative charge, that will get things in and out of the cell. But sometimes you actually need a little bit of resources, namely in the form of energy, so that you can actually get the gradient. Now, there's all these other things. That's the phospholipid, right? Exactly. And there's these other things that other things in the cell bind to. So bacteria and archaea, they're no longer called prokaryotes. They're each a domain. They don't have any subcellular compartments like a nucleus, like a mitochondria, chloroplast, or any of the other things that they need for translating DNA into proteins. So eukaryotes have cells with a nucleus in them, containing the entire genome. All in humans, that's all 3 billion base pairs. And they, of course, have many specialized organelles. They're all different kinds of cell types, and so what makes different cell types? Well, all cells contain the same genes, but can use different sets of these genes to develop into the different cell types. So, remember, every cell has a complete genome, but only certain cells only certain DNA is used to make a certain kind of cell or to develop into a specific kind of cell. So as I mentioned, archaea and bacteria don't have organelles like mitochondria, chloroplast, and they don't have a nucleus. This is the inside of a eukaryotic cell. There's a nucleus. Let's see. Here's a mitochondria. Let's get another thing. Okay. Mitochondria are the kind of power plants of the cell. Cells have lots of them. The cells that do more work than others have more of them. And then what's actually happened here is with a eukaryotic cell, there's been a division of labor. So there's all this stuff where the nuclear material is, the DNA, and that's inside the nucleus. And the mitochondria also has its own little strand of DNA as well. But we'll go over exactly what happens when you have transcription from the DNA into an RNA, which is a single strand, and then that's carried out of the cell and into the cytoplasm where all these other things are. And then finally, these ribosomes are the ones that turn it into protein. Okay. And as I mentioned, you don't need to memorize these things. First of all, proteins, there are structural proteins. Like the proteins, let's say, in our muscles, Those are structural proteins, but there's also a whole array of metabolic functions that proteins actually do. They, some of them are enzymes, so they cut other proteins or DNA at certain places. Now, in terms of the DNA that is inside the nucleus, every cell in the body has a complete copy of the genome. In other words, my skin cell has the whole genome, 3 billion base pairs. My eyes have all the cells, they all have the whole genome. The difference is that some cells express different genes. So the genes aren't always turned on or off all the time. Now there are some things that all cells must do, and so they're using those genes. But then there's others that are only specific to certain cell types. So, signaling proteins, like hormones, is a good example. Insulin, adrenaline, all sorts of different things. Then proteins also help transport molecules, let's say, between cells and also within cells. So from the cytoplasm into the nucleus and back out again. Cytoskeletal proteins allow muscle contraction and cell movement. Antibody proteins, part of our immune defense. Receptor proteins, they receive signals and alter cell function. And then enzymes actually catalyze chemical reactions. And they do this by enzymes lower activation energy for chemical reactions. So the normal activation curve is up pretty high for that reaction to proceed. But with an enzyme, it lowers the activation energy, and so you don't need as much energy for the chemical reaction to happen. Okay, so as I mentioned, they catalyze reactions within our bodies, both inside and outside the cell. There's anything with an NAse, like alcohol dehydrogenase, that's an enzyme. They all end with ASE. And it turns out that's what breaks down alcohol. Lactase breaks down milk and lactose. The DNA polymerase makes copies of your DNA when a cell is divided. So enzymes are, they do so much. A lot of the problems, if you have a mutation in an enzyme, you oftentimes have a metabolic genetic disease, and they're pretty bad. Now, what a polymer is a long chain of amino acids. So this kind of goes through what a general amino acid looks like. And then you start putting them together. There's a total of 21 amino acids that are found in living things. Some of those are essential, where we have to get it from outside our bodies. Others we can make ourselves. So valine is an amino acid, alanine, phenylalanine. Okay. So here's a strand of DNA. Double-stranded T, C, G, C, G. Okay. So this is a triplet codon, and ACC codes for a certain amino acid. And then that amino acid, that's part of the protein, building a protein, because proteins are made of whatchamacallit, amino acids. And they're long strands. Some proteins are very, very, very long. A codon is always 3 base pairs. And it's kind of a universal sort of code. So proteins are a source of energy, but more so building blocks. So we need energy, we need proteins so that we can make proteins. You can find proteins, by the way, in plants as well. You can also find it in steak, in eggs, all sorts of different places. Anywhere, anything that's living will have proteins. So, we kind of ask, why can't we just make all of our amino acids from scratch? Well, we do make many, but there are some that we can't, and the ones that we can't make on our own are called essential amino acids. Oh, it's 20 amino acids, that's right. So we can make 13 out of the 20, and the other 7 are essential. So histidine, isoleucine, can read all that. The ones 13, the non-essential, we actually can make ourselves. Our cells make those amino acids. There's also some, I think, that are conditionally essential. Probably you don't get enough of them, that your body doesn't make enough of them, so you need extra. Okay, here we go. Now, some of you have probably heard about tryptophan. Supposedly turkey has a lot of tryptophan, and then of course, after eating a lot of turkey, supposedly people get sleepy. That's not true. They get sleepy because they overate. It's as simple as that. When you have that much digestion going on, there's just not a whole lot left for going on upstairs, right? So now tryptophan is used to make a neurotransmitter, and it's also an essential amino acid, and that serotonin is a neurotransmitter. There are a bunch of different systems in our brain. One is a norepinephrine system, one is a serotonin system, another one. And they all have to act properly. Melatonin is actually a hormone that affects sleep. So we're going to apply the scientific method to turkey. Tryptophan is a precursor for sleep-inducing hormone. I always get sleepy when I eat turkey. The tryptophan in turkey causes my sleepiness. So, if turkey causes sleepiness, then it should have higher tryptophan levels than other foods I eat. It should be the king of tryptophan. But, as you can see, turkey is not relatively high in tryptophan. So it's an urban legend. Let's see. Egg white is 1. Oh, protein percent. Right. Let's see. Sesame seeds are pretty high. There's turkey. Yeah, there's turkey. 1.11. So there's a lot of proteins that have much more tryptophan in them. So here we are again. Turkey doesn't have. We disfalsified the hypothesis because our prediction is essential to the hypothesis that turkey had the highest levels of tryptophan, and that's why we get sleepy. So we have to come up with an alternative hypothesis. So in terms of turkey and sitting down for Thanksgiving, one obvious alternative hypothesis is that people who overeat tend to get sleepy. So we go through the whole process again. Now, vitamins, they act as coenzymes. They attach to enzymes and help make them work. Vitamins we can't synthesize on our own. Almost not. We can make vitamin D on our own just by being outside and getting sunlight. Vitamin D is conditional, as we can get it from the sunlight, as I mentioned. So, vitamin C is an essential cofactor, enzyme that regulates collagen structure, which is connective tissue in our bodies. Without it, your connective tissue becomes weak, loosens. Without vitamin C, you get a disease called scurvy. British sailors were called limeys because they would send along lots of limes so everybody could get enough tryptophan. Enough vitamin C. Without it, scurvy's pretty lousy. Your teeth fall out, your hair falls out, it's just a mess. So you absolutely need it. There are other enzyme vitamins that also cause problems like, I think it's vitamin B, something is rickets. So these are essential. Now, I do want to point out something. Everybody, they sell, how many of you in here eat vitamins? Yeah, okay. They're supposedly good for you. Most of them are water soluble, so if you take too much, they just go right out. But they've been doing some studies lately about vitamins and a multivitamin, all that. And what they found is that they did a study where someone was given fruits and vegetables. Another was given fruits and vegetables and vitamins. Another was given vitamins. And then another was given nothing. And they looked at some outcome data, in other words, what happens over time. And interestingly enough, the vegetables and fruits, those are actually better for you than any vitamins. Now you would think sometimes you should take vitamins because let's say you live in sub-Saharan Africa, you have a lousy diet, and you don't have enough vitamins, among other things. Well, that's good to supplement vitamins in that case. But I think we've been sold a bill of goods, essentially, about vitamins. Especially if you actually look at health-wise, it's better not to take vitamins. Now, it's probably not going to hurt you a whole lot, but I just want you to know that you're probably wasting your money. It's part of the whole health industry, whatever that is. You know, it's natural, all that kind of stuff. Cyanide-producing compounds are natural as well in plants, and they'll kill you. So, not everything that's natural is good. We also need a certain amount of minerals. So, iron is a cofactor for hemoglobin, which is red blood cells that transport oxygen to our cells, and then CO2 from our cells back out. When I showed you the diagram of the cell, there's all these ion balances, positive and negative, and that sets up a gradient, and you need a lot of these kind of ions. So manganese plus potassium and chloride, which is a minus. So certain minerals are important for bone formation, calcium, for example. All minerals come from our diet. We can't get it anywhere else. Now, there's this idea that, anybody know what an antioxidant is? Okay. And what do antioxidants do? Free radicals. So during metabolism, there's these things called free radicals that are highly reactive molecules. In fact, a good example is the ozone layer, and ozone is kind of an unstable form of oxygen. So antioxidants supposedly neutralize free radicals. I don't think anybody's actually ever really tested this. It sounds good. It sounds like a possible explanation. But I don't know if it actually is true or not. Now, of course, antioxidants for you are a big deal. They're trying to sell you antioxidants, right? Eat lots of blueberries. All kinds of stuff. Now, frankly, I don't have a problem eating blueberries because I love them. But this is another thing in the health industry that really hasn't been tested. Now, it seems like free radicals might cause problems with metabolism and aging and things like that. But I don't think anybody's actually ever tested this. Fats are good for you. They're considered high in cholesterol, right? Which isn't good for you. But you know how they've been telling you for ages that you've got to limit your cholesterol intake, even though most of the cholesterol that you have is made by our liver. Well, it just came out recently that the kind of cholesterol that we eat from fats it's kind of a sterile fat, really doesn't cause problems with cholesterol. So that was another thing that's kind of a fairy tale. Now, I don't want you guys to go out and just, you know, eat a stick of butter or something like that. But fats are not thought to be anymore, thought to be as bad as they were once. Now, fats, most of our energy, well, the basic energy unit is glucose. And we can store glucose, a lot of organisms store glucose. But fats are a better source for actually storing lots and lots and lots of energy. And then, of course, we talked about fatty acid bilayer earlier in this talk. So fats are essential for cell function and structure. So here's our cell membrane. What did I do with it? Right in front of me. Okay, so we can actually synthesize most fatty acids from scratch. I'm looking for my glasses. Yeah, oh, there's somewhere. Okay. Carbohydrates on the outside, and then our phospholipid bilayer, which is made of fatty acids, right here. So, we can't make all of our fatty acids from scratch, so what are the ones that we can't make from scratch called? Remember about what we talked about earlier in terms of amino acids? Starts with an E. Essential. So, some fatty acids we can make from scratch, those are not essential. And then the ones that we can't make from scratch are. And all cells, just so you know, have this phospholipid bilayer. Now, carbohydrates are water soluble, fats aren't. And this is bilayer exactly to keep things from going into the cell or from leaking out of the cell. And so that's why you have these, on the one side is carbohydrates for outside of the cell, an aqueous solution, and then inside the cell, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on, and you don't want that to escape. Right. Okay, so you can kind of see the structure. Saturated, it all lines up. Basically, saturated fats are solid at room temperature. Unsaturated aren't. Saturated tend to kink and are kind of liquid. So, supposedly the saturated fats are the ones that are bad for you, but that's so saturated fats, they have carbons that are bound to a lot more hydrogens. Most animal fats are, of course, saturated. So most plant fats are basically unsaturated. There we go. don't go, I'm going to do a whatchamacallit, top hat. Okay. So this is where we left off. Oh, boy. Turn this down. Okay. We talked about fats. There's two kind of types. There's unsaturated. There's actually three kinds, and then polyunsaturated. So they're not bound to as much hydrogens. I think we can go back. Now we can also basically turn unsaturated fats into saturated by adding hydrogens to it, and so that's where you get margarine. And then partially hydrogenated fats are trans fats. You're supposed to stay away from those, but actually things have changed. So this is what used to be thought. Unsaturated fats have health benefits like the Mediterranean diet, you guzzle olive oil, things like that. Saturated fats increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. And then a lot of fats, you also get cholesterol, which is a kind of fat, a steroidal fat. And it was thought that you actually got cholesterol, you get it from your liver and supposedly from your food. It's wrong. They came out with some they finally had some data. Before this, they were making guesses, but they didn't really have any data. When they had all these food guidelines, the food pyramid and all that. So it turns out that very little cholesterol we actually get from our food. And there's also a question about whether saturated fats, in fact, are actually that bad for you. It seems like what we thought used to be bad. It was, oh God, what was it? There was a movie by Woody Allen years ago called Sleeper, where he's been frozen cryogenically. They wake him up, in a couple hundred years. And back in his day, all the things that were thought to be wheat germ and organic and all that kind of stuff was thought to be good for you, is now turning out to be bad. Well, in the movie they kind of comment on that, and it's actually coming true. So I'm not going to tell you to go out and eat a ribeye steak, but I would. They're really tasty. And this business about, certainly one thing that these, like carbohydrates, processed carbohydrates that you get in a lot of processed foods, they're not good for you. If you want to put on weight, eat those. So I think they let the saturated fats protocol kind of stand, but there's not much science to it, just so you know. But the stuff on all the other kinds of fats are really clear. You can basically eat as much of those as you want, like omega-3s, all that kind of stuff. And they're better for you. And they don't do anything as far as your cholesterol. Cholesterol is, we use it for all sorts of different things, the steroid. We use it for building cell membranes, steroid hormones. It's not water soluble. have to be carried by lipid-based particles, which are fat. And that's why it's associated, in fact, with, they thought it was associated with food you ate, but it doesn't appear to be. That's the case. So this is all wrong. But as far as the kind of LDL or HDL, HDL is a bad kind, and LDL is a good kind, and you want more of the LDL. Let's see. Oh, no, I got it wrong. Okay. You want HDL, listing target, and okay, yeah, right. Yeah, so the LDL is the stuff that clogs your arteries, and, you know, they snapshot and you're dead. So carbohydrates. We all know what carbs are. Sugar is a simple carb. The sugar that we eat is called sucrose. It's a dimer sugar, where it has basically two glucoses stuck together. Then there are more complex carbs like potatoes, where there's basically long chains of carbohydrates. And then with Brussels sprouts, they're carbs, but a lot of it is basically structural cellulose that doesn't do much except, you know, clean out your gut. So they're made of carbon and water, basically OH. And is that right? No, I guess not. So it's always a multiple of CX. X is a variable, can be any sort of number attached to a couple of one oxygen and two hydrogen, or maybe a couple of oxygen. That's right. So you can basically form long chains of it. And that's pretty much what you get from a lot of food, like plants. That's what plants make. They make these long chains of carbon, and every time you break a bond, you get energy out of it. So they make these carbohydrates, well, carbohydrates for the most part, but some more complex, when they do photosynthesis. That's where basically all the food that is on this planet comes from. That's the top of the food chain. That's right, saccharides. So, there are monosaccharides, which are glucose and fructose. That means they just have a single, that's a single glucose monomer. You can see the carbons, and on one side is a hydrogen, the other side is a hydroxyl. And then there's disaccharides, which is basically sucrose, where you get a glucose and a fructose stuck together. Now, the glucose you can metabolize immediately. That is actually what's transported by insulin, or is allowed, it's carried and then transported into the cell for food. With disaccharides, the body breaks those down into monosaccharides. And then polysaccharides, starch and cellulose. Starch, potatoes, but a lot of cellulose we can't actually, we can't break down, we can't digest. So, as I mentioned earlier, like starch, they're basically complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides. They're long chains of sugars, and they take longer to break down into the glucose constituents. And the only kind of sugar that we can actually use is glucose. That's what we use in terms of our cellular functions. And the mitochondria are the ones that actually use the glucose and turn it into energy. Now, cellulose is a lot of structural carbohydrates. So if you think about tree trunks and celery, you know, there's not much there. Basically, it's a great way to keep your gut flowing properly. But that's basically, cellulose is the stuff that plants use for structure. So most plants store complex carbs. Root vegetables, for example, rice, potatoes, corn, and they all use basically complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides. So the structure on top, all the leafy stuff, that's mainly cellulose. The starchy stuff for the potato plant is all underground. Now, of course, corn is above ground, but it's still a starch, a polysaccharide. So cellulose is basically called, it's not indigestible fiber. It's a dietary fiber. Fiber is not a nutrient per se. In other words, you don't get any glucose out of it. But it certainly helps with intestinal mobility, influencing our cholesterol balance, slowing down the sugar absorption. Animals are not able to break down cellulose on their own, but like a cow. So you think, well, that's all they're eating all the time is grass. So how do they do it? And turns out there's symbiotic bacteria in their guts that do all the breakdown. So the bacteria break it down. The bacteria, of course, get a safe place to live. I don't know. Anyway, so we have these symbiotic bacteria in a lot of these ruminants that break down complex carbohydrates into glucose so that it can be used in the cells, transported then across the membranes into the circulatory system. So insects like termites also have the same sort of things, these bacteria. Without them, they wouldn't be able to digest any sort of cellulose. It turns out, just so you know, we have more bacteria in us and on us by far than the number of cells that make up our body. Okay? I mean, huge numbers. There's different kinds of bacteria on my skin, different parts of the skin. Let's see, where else? Oh, well, then there's different bacteria in my mouth, in my nose, in my ears, in my intestinal tract. Huge numbers of bacteria that we really almost didn't even know were there beforehand. And they also help us digest things like proteins and whatnot. But it turns out that we really didn't know what this microbiome, small biome full of living things, which are mostly bacteria, but also fungi, let's see what else, a number of different things. Most of this stuff actually, it doesn't cause any harm at all. In fact, it actually makes for a good environment for breaking down food. Now, you can actually get diseases, let's say like cholera, that invade and kind of wipe out your whole microbiome. And of course, the color you get really sick and some people die. But it's come to light recently that our microbiome in our gut is strongly tied to our immune system and how an immune system actually develops. So when babies are born, they get these immune chemicals from their mothers, but they have very weak immune systems. And so that's why babies are especially susceptible to infections and stuff until they get to a certain age. But the immune system actually develops in concert with the microbiome that a baby gets. So the baby gets microbiome from the mother and these immunochemicals, and then the body's immune system is sort of trained about what is self and what is non-self. And you want the immune system to always attack the non-self, not the self. You can get autoimmune disorders where it actually attacks the self, and that's where this whole thing comes in with the gut microbiome and the immune system developing. Because it apparently looks like that in the past, more people have like freaked out about microbes and bacteria and viruses and all that kind of stuff, because some of them actually cause, of course, disease. But it turns out that, let's see, so our immune system gets trained about what's right. Well, in the past, kids were a lot dirtier. They were. I went outside, I played outside all the time, up in the Hollywood Hills. I'm sure when I was a little kid, I was always putting things in my mouth, you know, all that. My sister one time, she had a very finicky eating habit. She didn't like anything but Chef Boyardee SpaghettiOs. And my parents were worried that she wasn't getting enough proteins and whatnot. So my sister's about a year and a half old. She's out in the garden. She's crawling around. And she's chewing on something, and it turns out it was a snail. You know, kind of escargot sushi. Right. Not really good. And my mom runs out to stop her and then stops herself. She's thinking, it's protein. I mean, she needs protein. She won't eat it. So she let her just go on that way. It's amazing. But anyway, that's an aside. There's a lot of autoimmune diseases that appear to be connected to living in a microbe-free world. So all these antiseptic creams and all that, they're actually bad for you because you don't have a very good immune system. You get allergies, you get autoimmune diseases, multiple sclerosis. Oh God, there's a slew of them that seem to be increasing in number the cleaner people get. So actually, if you have kids or you're going to have kids, you want them to eat dirt. You do. It'll help train their immune systems. I swear to God. Now, you can only break down carbohydrates, in other words, glucose, to glucose. But then if you have too much circulating carbohydrates, it has to go somewhere. And so it's basically stored in the liver. So each gram of glycogen is bound by 3 grams of water. In fact, it's kind of interesting, but a lot of small animals in the desert where there isn't much water get all the water they need from breaking down and using glycogen. So like kangaroo rats, they don't need to drink anything. They don't need to eat anything with free water in it. They can actually make all the water they need just by metabolizing glycogen. So your brain, basically, we only use carbs. And then when we first exercise, we start burning through carbs. And then glycogen in the muscle, and then from the liver. So there's also glycogen in the muscles as well. So that's kind of the order in which basically carbohydrates are metabolized. Metabolism. Anabolic buildup, synthesis of muscle, storage of fat. So you think about anabolic steroids, get huge. You also, if there's a guy, you'll start growing breasts and things like that. Make your muscles build up. Now, catabolic is breaking down. So, of course, with glycogen and fat usage, it's aerobic. We're using oxygen as part of the process. And then for catabolic, our muscles use this energy to do work. So complex carbs are digested slowly because you have to break down those sugars and all those bonds. Simple sugars enter our system very rapidly. So look like they look like blueberries. So you can tell basically if you're feeling weak, you haven't eaten enough, you want to get carbs into your system, you use simple carbs. So like diabetics, if they take too much insulin, they usually drink orange juice or something like that. It goes right to the system. Now, a lot of glucose metabolism, as I was mentioning, insulin, that's a hormone. Hormones they're basically proteins, and they do work. They carry molecules for all sorts of different cellular functions. Basically insulin is a small protein hormone that's in the pancreas that triggers cells to take up glucose via the GLUT4 pathway. It binds to a receptor which starts many protein activation cascades. These include translocation of a GLUT4 transporter to the plasma membrane of the cell, influx of glucose, glycogen synthesis, glycolysis, breaking it down, and triglycerides. So you can actually see a little schematic here. Okay, so here's our free glucose. Here's insulin, an insulin receptor, so the insulin actually binds to the receptor. And then this transporter that actually transports the glucose into the cell, and here's a cell. And then there's pathways for making glycogen and things like that. So 1 is the insulin, 2 is, turning it into pyruvate. Oh, doesn't make any sense. Okay, 3, 4, and you can see. So glucose is one of the hormones. We have tons of hormones. All the neurotransmitters in our brain, epinephrine, serotonin, all that kind of stuff. They're all essentially hormones, proteins that are manufactured by the cells. So some people have high metabolic rates. Some people have slow metabolic rates. And it's usually influenced by many factors: your body weight and composition. The more muscle you have, usually the faster your metabolism is. Activity level, genetic makeup, and the ecology and evolution of the environment where you get your food sources. So, as you probably know, a lot of people nowadays get type 2 diabetes, non-insulin dependent. What happens is the cells become insulin resistant. You think, well, why is this happening? And it turns out, what do you think our food environment was like 1,000 years ago? Huh? Healthier? Okay. Anybody? You're certainly eating natural things, right? Okay. But remember, naturalism is not only good, it's, stop it. There's a lot of cyanide compounds in a lot of plants, so you have to watch what you're eating. Okay. Anything else? Someone, yeah.
Well, they were hunter-gatherers, right?
Yeah.
But even with like there's cyanide in those plants, it's still like a trace element, so that doesn't.
Yeah, well, there's some plants, of course, they have to learn how to avoid. So water hemlock, for example, will kill you right away in the most horrible death. Anything else about the food environment in the past?
Did they not cook it yet?
What? Oh, they had fire.
Okay, so.
Yep, certainly had fire. That certainly helps in being able to digest a lot of stuff that otherwise you couldn't. Anything else about the food environment? Think about how much food is out there. Okay, a lot. Okay. Hmm? There was a lot more food. Okay. What evidence do you have of that?
There was like less humans.
Yeah.
Nowadays there's like so many more humans.
Mm-hmm. They were all hunter-gatherers, but in ecology, it's the interaction between organisms and their environment, and there's usually a limit to how large a population can grow depending on the amount of food that's available. Okay? So, with hunter-gatherers, you usually need more food than you do with, let's say, farming, even though farming gives you mostly complex carbohydrates and not much else. You can support a lot more people on them. So hunter-gatherers, you're kind of limited on the amount of food that's actually available. Yeah?
I was going to say there's not those genetically modified.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking about 1,000 years ago. We'll talk about GMOs in a second. There. Okay. Now, think about your running around hunting for food and gathering plant materials for food, and there's a big drought, huge drought. What do you think happens to all your food? Goes away, right? The amount of food that was originally there that could support a certain population size is not there anymore. So, what does that cause? Starts with an F. Famine, right? So, you might think of the hunter-gatherers of the past as noble savages. Okay? The thing is, food supplies vary. if you go to places like Africa, and a lot of countries in Africa where food supplies vary, or the Middle East. So Syria and the whole Eastern Mediterranean has been going over. They've had a drought for the last 3 or 4 years, and there's actually some evidence to support the idea. It's correlational at this point that, in fact, all the problems in Syria at their basis has to do with a drought and food shortages. Okay. So, in the past, there were probably times of food plenty, and then times of food scarcity. There still are that kind of things today, but not to the same extent. Well, when there's food aplenty, what you really want to do is you want to store as much, basically, energy in the form of fat or glycogen as you possibly can. And then, of course, during a famine, you don't know when it is. So nowadays, people that rely on kind of simple farming, usually there's, at the end of the season, when they've harvested everything, they've eaten almost everything, they're waiting for the new crop to come in, there's usually food scarcity then. It's kind of an annual sort of thing. But sometimes, like I said, there's a really big famine. And if a body is able to store, which body would more likely survive a famine? The one that stores more carbohydrates and fat, or the one that does less? More, right? Okay. Now, we don't live in this kind of food environment anymore, do we? We can go out and basically get all the food we need. Now, there's certain things that you are more expensive to get, but you can get everything you need. Including, so when there was a famine, people weren't thinking about, oh, I've got to get grains and I've got to eat fresh vegetables and all this kind of stuff. They weren't thinking about that. They need calories. I mean, just basic, you need a certain number of calories that you can burn and you can actually, for metabolism. Without that, you basically can't survive a famine. Now, you've got all these stores of energy. So it turns out in the past, people who had a phenotype in terms of the way they use food, they had a metabolism that was slower and more thrifty. So every time it got a chance to store food, it would in the form of fat. And then a famine would come along, and lo and behold, what would happen? All the skinny people would die. Right? They would. Now, nowadays, let's think about this food environment that we're in, where there's not a scarcity of food, at least in terms of food. Was that a... No, I guess it was your paper. All right. So, now we're in a different food environment. There's not a food scarcity. Who likes to be in shape? Everybody? Yeah. Okay. This kind of skinny phenotype. Lots of muscle, high metabolism. The kind of metabolism that in fact would kill you in the old days during a famine. Now, it's good. So what does the other phenotype look like nowadays? Huh? Small, big, large, what? People with a lot of fat on them. Okay? Now, they have a perfect body for a famine environment. They're the ones that survive. So you wonder why are some people more prone to diabetes? Why are some people more prone to obesity? It's basically because in most of our evolutionary history, our ancestors had to deal with famines. They don't have to anymore. And so what you actually get nowadays is you get a phenotype that not only puts on fat, but there's a whole slew of things that goes with it, including type 2 diabetes. If you put someone, a type 2 diabetic, and you put them on basically the kind of diet you would have eaten in the past, their diabetes would go away. You might not like the diet very much, but it would go away. Also, all the cardiovascular effects that go with that. So basically we have a phenotype from the past that was at one time very adaptive, right? Those with that phenotype, when there was periods of famine, survived and left more offspring than the skinny ones. But nowadays, that phenotype is not adaptive. It leads to all sorts of problems. Of course, usually you don't start seeing insulin resistance and diabetes until, let's say, middle age. And by that time, you pretty much had all the children you're going to have, so it doesn't really matter. But there's even instances nowadays where kids are, like of 9 to 10, are developing diabetes. It's extraordinary. So it's not so much that obese people are at fault for, eating ice cream sundaes all the time. In fact, a lot of them eat a lot less than you do, but their bodies put on that weight. And it's all because of the food environment that we're in now, compared to what it was in the past. I just went through all this. Okay. Now, of course, we also have foods nowadays that are just plain calories. Simple sugars that is breaking down right immediately that in the past we wouldn't have. In the past, it was rare that we'd come across a lot of glucose or fructose in the environment. We eat some with fruit and stuff like that, but a big store of it would be, honey. Okay? It wasn't the kind of thing that you would commonly eat all the time. The same thing with fats. A lot of the animals that they killed didn't have much fat on them. If you've ever eaten a deer, they're very lean meat. And so, again, our bodies in the past, from our past hunter-gatherer days, anytime they came across a store of really thick, good fat, they'd eat it like crazy. And they'd take up glucose-rich honey stores or sweet stores and eat that the same way. The thing is, we're surrounded by that all the time. So in the past, we would smell, let's say, something like fat cooking. And boy, you just turn your ravenous, right? And you want to gobble it all up. Well, we still react that way to fat. You smell it being fried up or whatever, and it's like, that's good. Same thing with sweet things like energy drinks and sodas and all that that are simple carbohydrates that are just plain lousy calories. It was not the same in our ancestral food environment. Now, in some places, people lived a lot better than others. In some places it was probably like a paradise, but not necessarily all the time. So, diabetes. There's two kinds, essentially. There's type 1, which is glucose dependent. It's an autoimmune disorder, like I was talking about earlier, when the body's immune system is developing. It usually shows up in childhood, and it destroys the beta cells in the pancreas that actually secrete insulin. You actually need insulin injections all the time. One of the big problems with any kind of diabetes, blood sugar, especially going up or down. And so a lot of these individuals is trying to keep their insulin levels steady so that they don't start having circulatory problems like they usually, a lot of them go blind, a lot of them have kidney disease, all sorts of different things. And then there's type 2, which we went through just now. And you can talk about, I already went through it, about the food environment and what it was like. And where a certain phenotype, in terms of metabolism, would do well versus not, depending on the food environment. Anybody in here can't drink milk? Okay, lactose intolerant? Okay. So normally, if you think about, well, let's think about mammals. Mammals are the only ones that actually produce milk. When is milk usually used? What? Yeah, so when you're young, you're getting milk from your mother, that's when you need milk. Now, milk is actually sugar. It's called lactose, and you can break it down in a certain way with a certain enzyme called lactase. And so, for babies or for any sort of very young mammals, food is, lactose is great. But, of course, as they grow up, they don't need it anymore. I mean, what are they going to do? Follow their mother around the whole time? Until she's dead, and then they're dead, because they can't get any more food. So, usually what happens is, the production of lactase, which is an enzyme that makes it possible to actually use lactose as a food source, diminishes until it's basically turned off. No more lactase, you can't use milk anymore. And for most mammals, that's fine. You're going to get weaned and you're going to be living on your own. You're not going to have a source of milk anymore. But it turns out that humans, in what are called pastoral societies, pastoralists are herders of domesticated animals, goats, sheep, cattle, horses, camels, all that kind of stuff. Now, when those animals were domesticated, they weren't domesticated necessarily for milk at all. They were domesticated for, meat and things like that. But there was in at least one population, let's say in the Middle East, where a lot of these pastoralists were living. The Middle East doesn't look like it used to in the past. It was much wetter. Those pastoralists, there might have been an individual who had a mutation that kept the lactase gene on and was therefore able to actually use milk. And probably found that out. Let's say during a famine, people would try to probably drink milk, they wouldn't be successful, they died, but this one actually survived. And of course, when a specific allele, let's say, is adaptive, it's going to increase in the population because the individual who has it is going to leave more offspring. So you see in these pastoralist cultures, is the ability, basically lactose tolerance, where you can actually use lactose as a food source. And you can imagine how useful that would be because you have a ready source of milk from the animals you're using. You don't have to rely on women anymore. And also during famines, perhaps at least the early part before the animals die, you're likely to have a food source that you can use. Now, there are certain areas in the world and people from those areas that tend to have lactose tolerance, where they can actually utilize milk, and those that can't. And they're always associated with a pastoralist sort of culture, a herding society. So the Middle East, and it looks like the pastoralists there eventually moved into Europe, and especially nowadays, like Northern Europeans had a lot of dairying. They had, dairy cows and all that for a long, long time. And so usually people from Northern Europe are capable of metabolizing milk and all the things that go with it. Native Americans in this country, they never had pastoralist societies. I think they had vicunas down in South America, but I don't think they at all got any milk from them. So most Native Americans, it turns out, are lactose intolerant because of that. There's also, in Africa, there's two separate populations of people, and in each one, they developed a mutation that allowed them to use milk. They had a lactose, an upstream promoter region that kept the lactase gene on. And in fact, the lactase gene itself did not change. It was all a matter of whether the gene was turned on or off. So this is kind of like, this is what happens. We have the lactase enzyme. Here's the enzyme. Here's lactose. This is galactose. And so what happens is the enzyme has these surfaces that these molecules bind to, and then they can actually they can break down lactose into sucrose, which is a disaccharide, and then they'll be broken down further. So it's kind of the metabolism of why we're able to drink milk. But it's basically an it's an adaptation. Normally it wouldn't be an adaptation for most mammals. It's a waste of energy to make lactase if you don't need it. Now it turns out that we don't really use glucose per se for energy. The coin that we use in terms of cellular metabolism is called ATP. So there's this long cycle called the Krebs cycle that turns glucose into ATP. You can't store ATP. You turn it into ATP and you have to use it right away. So you have this enzyme. In fact, there's a lot of different enzymes. You add phosphorus to it, and then you get an intermediate called ADP. There's a whole bunch of intermediates that go through this cycle. This is a cellular respiration cycle, where essentially, with this you can get like 38 ATP for each molecule of glucose. Whereas other ways, like the fermentation pathways, you can only get 1 or 2. So it's a very effective way of turning energy into real energy. Glucose metabolism happens in the mitochondria. We have these, remember we talked about eukaryotes, they have all these little organelles besides a big nucleus. Mitochondria are the furnaces. And you need oxygen. It's actually an oxidative reduction chemical pathway. That's where you get most of the ATP. Now, you can do without oxygen, it's called glycolysis. So you get something called lactate plus ATP, lactic acid. So if you're an athlete, you have free glucose circulating in your system, all that's good, but then you run out. So in the muscles, you're not able to use that. All you're able to do is glycolysis, where you don't get nearly as much ATP, and lactic acid builds up in your muscles. So aerobic conditions, this is where we get most of our energy. There are some, like bacteria, that are anaerobic bacteria that die if they're in the presence of oxygen. The glucose that you get from glycogen stores, that's the first thing that's used. You also get breakdown of fatty acids. And not until you burn through all your fat will your body actually start to break down muscle protein for energy. Using muscle protein for energy is a very inefficient way to get energy. So, anaerobic conditions where there's, where let's say you're a sprinter, of course, and you quickly overuse your aerobic capacity. The amount of oxygen you take into your lungs and circulate through. And so this anaerobic breakdown is what happens. And the first thing they're going to do is you're going to start breaking down muscles. So a calorie is a unit of energy. There's a bunch of different units of energy, but the one that we use here is basically 1,000 calories is what we call 1 calorie. It's basically a kilocalorie. So basically 3,500 calories from, let's say, 1 pound of fat. Fat is a great way to store excess calories compared to carbohydrates. Body fat index. This is a weight to height ratio. The amount of fat to the amount of muscle and the size that they are. So a BMI of 30 or higher is considered obese. A healthy range is 20 to 25. It's not the same as percent body fat, but it's correlated, obviously. Muscles weigh a lot more than fat in general. There's a bunch of ways to weigh it. Hydrostatic, where you actually float. Very important. So, building muscle. Who in there works out? Okay. You go for big muscles or? Yeah, of course. So, one of the things that you do, of course, is muscle fatigue. So you get in there and you're actually breaking down muscle, not totally, but a little bit. You need amino acids, right? And you need a certain amount of energy for anabolic reactions. That means building up. And that requires what we were talking about earlier, ATP. So ATP is the currency that a cell uses to actually do work. You can't build muscle while at a calorie deficit. It just doesn't happen. It's metabolically impossible. So if you decide, oh, I want to lose weight and build muscle at the same time, it's worthless. Because you need calories to build muscle. Muscle's expensive. Let's see, muscle miss. If I lift heavy weights, I might look like that. Or if I'm lifting light weights for many reps, because I just want tone. I guess these are myths. So muscle tone is a product of two things. How much muscle is there and how much fat is on top of it. Okay, so you can build muscle with heavy weights, amino acids, and calories. Salute. And you can lose fat, take in fewer calories that you expend than you expend. So in other words, building muscle and losing fat are incompatible with each other. And so efficient muscle building and fat loss are basically just what I said. Okay. Is that it? That's it. Okay, we're going to go on to another topic now. But in the meantime,